keep them down on the farm after they seen Harry? How you gonna keep them away from Broadway, jazzing around and painting the town? How you gonna keep them away from harm? That's a mystery. Imagine Reuben.
Good day, everybody. My name is Sergio Lugo, and I'm glad to meet you. Let me give you a little bit of background, and some of it is up there. Now, first of all, for those of you who aren't familiar with this, you may have seen this logo before, and you all have heard about the mother of all wars, etc. It all started with the American Red Cross is the mother of, of help and assistance, the mother of soldiers. And it was this poster that gave rise to the use of the term mother of, back in 1917. So I just wanted to mention that real quick for you. I am a stamp collector. As a stamp collector, I pick up little pieces of paper, and always fascinating to me, and I'll tell you why. Because I was never going to see these places, I was never going to find these places. I was never going to go to any of them. So stamps gave me a view to the world that most things did not. As it evolved, it became more than a hobby. In the course of my stamp collecting years, I started going into what is known as postal history. And all of you know what postal history is, but you don't think of it that way. Postal history are the envelopes you receive and save. Postal history documents routes, personages, rates, and events. And you can trace things through that postal history. And this is the stuff I started exploring, and I love it. I love it. Why? Because I was a history major and was a graduate student of international relations. And all of this stuff was always fascinating to me. In this particular case, I could bring to bear my military experience in a limited capacity, in a limited way. Okay, what are we going to talk about? We're talking about social welfare on the part of civilians in the United States in World War I. It's not that I'm particularly fond of World War I, but in my pursuit of postal history and my pursuit of these kinds of things, I stumbled upon this social welfare postal history about 25 years ago. I then began expanding my knowledge and my collections and my historical interests, and it revealed to me a world that most of us don't realize existed at one point in time in our country. I think all of you are going to be shocked when I say that our Army commanders in the 1910s and the 1900s were shocked that we should have to spend any time on physical training of soldiers. Hey, you all guys were all strong and fit and everything else and didn't need this stuff, period. Because that was a waste of time. It took valuable time away from learning how to shoot rifles, drilling, etc. It was the social welfare organizations, such as the YMCA and the Knights of Columbus, that introduced the requirement for physical fitness drills to maintain the physical fitness of soldiers. So all of you can blame the YMCA and the Knights of Columbus for having gotten you up at 5:30 in the morning to go and do physical fitness drills. So it was organizations like this that brought those kinds of perspectives into the operation of the military. Why? Because those organizations wanted to make sure for the welfare of the soldier. During the progressive era of the early 1900s, these organizations came to the fore in bringing these ideas and notions to the military. For those of you that ever went on R&R, to certain places, there were bases and locations established where men could go for R&R on their tour of duty from France. those resort areas and those recreation areas were operated by the YMCA. Why? Why were they created in the first place? That's the more important question. I'm sorry, but our allies made it a habit of cleaning up on American soldiers because those Americans were paid huge amounts of money, $21 a month compared to the $2 a month that a French soldier was paid. And by the way, we could charge them a lot more for food, drink, and sex, okay? And these organizations like the YMCA stepped up to try and control that and prevent that. And that's why you had the creation of those recreation centers. And of course, if any of you are familiar with it, after 4 months, a man was entitled to R&R in the United States Army. Unheard of, by the way, among the French and the British. You all realize that. The French and British, you got the chance to serve and serve and serve and serve, or die in, die in action. So, what we have is the start of this in the Civil War. The U.S. Christian Commission, their intention was primarily ministry, religious work, providing for the salvation of your soul was their belief. And this was a tremendously important, that was the organizing principle of such organizations as the YMCA and the Salvation Army and other religious organizations that came to the fore in these efforts. YMCA and the Christian Commission, there's a great little red book on it that if you ever find it was published in 1868 that you'll enjoy. They did try and serve both the Union and the Confederate armies, but most of their focus was on the Union Army. They followed a period of a hiatus of about 8 to 10 years, and then the YMCA efforts began again about 1892. And it continued through the Spanish-American War. But now, what you have is also the appearance of an organization known as the Knights of Columbus. Who does the Knights of Columbus serve? Who do the Knights? What? Yeah, the Catholics. Catholics. Not necessarily the church, okay? But Catholics, okay? Why was that? Anybody?
Most of them were Protestants.
Most of them were Protestants, yes. Most soldiers were Protestants. But what's happening here? At the turn of the century, at the beginning of in mid-century, a lot of whom? Irish, Italians, Mexicans in their ranks, people that are immigrating. And they're not Protestants. So the Knights of Columbus come into existence, and they're the second organization. And they're the second most prominent religiously based organization. What do? They do, among other things, the drills, getting the drills introduced. They start building huts. They start building recreation centers. The year 1900 starts the progressive era and make for a better society overall. Whether that was in labor relations, whether that was in industrial productivity, whether that was in educational achievement. But an important area for many of these progressives was the military, because the military didn't receive a whole lot of attention. Hey, those guys in the uniforms, okay, were taken care of by the government, and who cares about them after they've gone into the military? Well, you know that families did. You know that state governments did, etc., and they had to try and figure out what they could do with some of the soldiers and how to make life more improved for them. It also has attributes that are strongly associated with women's movements, okay? Women wanted to do something for the men in the military. It has something to do with women's ambitions as well during the progressive era, and connected to prohibition and suffrage. And what do I mean here? Women needed to secure the support of men to get such things as prohibition and suffrage passed. Simple as that. They could march as much as they wanted to, and they continued marching until they wanted to, until, for example, 1918, when President Wilson changed his mind to support a federal amendment to the Constitution
adopting women's suffrage. He then took the position that women had been such great contributors to the war effort that they should have the right to vote.
Now, I'm just going to jump ahead to 1919 real quick from 1914, basically to say that one of the legacies of this is keep in mind that the United States military took over all these social welfare operations basically in October of 1919. General Peyton March had ordered that the agencies in the Army would take them all over and operate them. Give me a reason why. Throw them all together. Efficiencies. They wanted control. The religiously based organizations swore to providing services to everybody in a uniform fashion. Unfortunately, in practice, that tended to break down, despite the best efforts of everybody to make sure that a Catholic priest was serving a Protestant or a Jew. But this Jew or Protestant is complaining about, hey, I'm being served by this Catholic priest. Yeah, same thing for the other organizations. The Salvation Army came, everyone knows that the Salvation Army is a Protestant organization, right? They objected to the unifying efforts of the YMCA to come up with a uniform way of serving Protestants of all faiths. Okay? They objected to it. No, you're trying to dilute our religion and religious beliefs, so the Salvation Army stepped in and did its own thing, etc., with many men. One of the things you'll find is towards the end of World War I, a term starts appearing that becomes extraordinarily familiar to us in World War II. United Services Organization, USO. Now, I don't know about all of you guys, but I always knew the USO, the United Services Organization, referred to the Army, the Navy, the Marine Corps, the Air Force, and the Coast Guard. That was the United Services Organization. Wrong. The United Services Organization refers to the YMCA, the YWCA, the American Red Cross, the Jewish Welfare Board, the Travelers Aid Association, and all service organizations working together to provide services to the military. The United States doesn't enter the war till 1917. Beginning about 1914, some of these service organizations begin to pop up. But they're not geared towards helping Americans because Americans aren't at war. But you had such organizations as the Fatherless Children of France. And they come about trying to help out the children of the many soldiers that were being killed on the Western Front, and they wanted to help out the children of those individuals. You had Belgian Relief. Belgian Relief had been, Belgium had been swamped by the German invasions, and they needed tremendous help of every kind. They start spawning other service organizations. One of the service organizations is the Christian Scientists. Christian Scientists started with their welfare-related committee in 1914, trying to help Christian scientists in Europe. And they established missions, they established outreach activities, etc., to serve Christian scientists in France, Germany, Czechoslovakia, and Austria. They begin as early as 1914. Organizations such as this start transitioning to serving Americans in 1917, when the realization is coming about that, hey, the only people that are serving our folks are Protestants in the YMCA. And if you're familiar with Christian Science, there's a very different view of theology and how you go about with spirituality in terms of spiritual healing and the salvation of souls. And so they wanted to make sure that Christian scientists were available to help those men out when they went into combat or when they were killed in action. Okay? We've talked about some of them. Some of the other ones, major ones, the National Lutheran Commission. Here are some examples. Others, American Chocolate Fund. Okay? Guess what they got to the soldiers in Europe, okay? American Tobacco Fund. Guess what they got to the soldiers in Europe? Others were organizations such as the Daughters of the American Revolution, trying to provide patriotic services, flags, material, etc. The Godmothers League. Godmothers League, most prominent in places like Virginia. Men don't have any family around, and so the godmothers, the women of the organization, step forward to serve as godmothers for soldiers, okay, who are on leave, etc., etc. Others, the Red Star Animal Relief Society. Well, they were really there, as I think all of you can understand, to help take care of horses, donkeys, and other animals, because those animals took up a lot of time and space within the military at the time, and no one ever treated them. The Women's Land Army. Women's Land Army was an organization that formed. National League for Women's Service, real interesting organization for those of you who never heard of them. The National League for Women's Service was the largest ad hoc women's organization in the country. At one time, outside of the Red Cross, at one time having 250,000 to 300,000 members. They operated clubs, off base and on base. They were the founders of military clubs for soldiers. The National Leagues for Women's Service had such things as flower trucks. Okay? They had knitting groups. These were occupational groups.
America's declaration of war was followed by President Wilson's call for support of the military.
There were a number of organizations that stepped forward. The American Red Cross didn't necessarily step forward. They were in it since 1914. American Red Cross had been chartered by the United States government and the United States Congress after the flood in Pennsylvania. Come on. The Johnstown flood. The Johnstown flood. To serve Americans in distress in the face of national catastrophes. They stepped forward and they expanded their services to serve the military. American Red Cross was, in fact, the largest public welfare organization working with the military in World War I. You had in the American Red Cross tracks such as this side of the trenches, talking about what's involved in warfare. You'll have stationery in the right for the Italian Red Cross and Americans that were there. You'll have maps that were produced. Okay? The ARC operated 47 ambulance units in the American Expeditionary Force. Again, remember, this stuff is not provided by the military. After all, the walking wounded can walk. There was another organization called the Committee for Training Camp Activities. That was created to try and coordinate the services of all these social welfare organizations. The CTCA, and some of the thinking here, arose for something that sometimes you hear of in modern day society, and that was concerns about social hygiene. Prevent venereal disease among the troops. That's what the term social hygiene referred to. Schools of thought believed strongly that social hygiene reduced the fighting effectiveness of the military, and there were too many occasions for improper behavior and improper activity on the part of soldiers. I think you all know that venereal disease issues accounted for high casualty rates and sickness rates in the military until penicillin came around. But social hygiene issues always affected the military in terms of dealing with the civilian population in the United States or overseas. So the CTCA's first concern was to ensure social hygiene within the camps. Second objective was to improve physical fitness training, resulting in physical fitness regimes. We talked about that. Third objective was providing dramatic presentations, movies. You've all heard of the traveling road shows throughout Europe, etc. Okay?
And fourth, funding, which I'll cover shortly.
It's in the United States basically about 300 social welfare organizations. There are 7 that come to prominence. Those are named and known as the 7 servants. You can hear stories and reports on the 7 servants and their organization on the internet from Rockefeller, who was the chairman of the Seven Servants Organization. The Seven Servants Organization came into being in April of 1917. So the major servants were some of the ones that are mentioned here. The American Library Association. What in the world does that have to do with welfare? Anybody? Anybody? The social. What?
Reading opportunities for soldiers.
Reading opportunities. Yeah, reading opportunities for soldiers. Why? You were going to say it. Enjoyment. For those of you that have ever been... Morale. Any of you that have ever been in combat, you know that books have a way of restoring a sense of normalcy to the soldier. I always had the opportunity to read books because in an armored personnel carrier, you could turn on the light inside and read, and that's what I was doing. There were other soldiers that would read in foxholes, get their little flashlight out, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the American Library Association knew that. They recognized that. They had to convince the commanders, hey, why don't we make sure that books are available? Okay, next one, Jewish Welfare Board. I was telling B earlier, are all of you familiar with things such as the Jewish community centers? You've heard of the Jewish community centers? Jewish community centers had their origins in the Jewish Welfare Board, created in 1917. Created in 1917 because Jews didn't have a unified voice to deal with the military, because they had so many religious organizations, so many factions, you know, among Reformed, Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox, etc., that they decided they needed to get together and let's present something that's beneficial for us in dealing with the military and dealing, by the way, with our community, because they didn't have a way to unify services to the community. That's why the JCCs eventually grew from the Jewish Welfare Boards. The Jewish Welfare Board provided about 100 chaplains to the active military. They had the biggest celebrations for people leaving to go overseas. They also made sure that the families were kept in contact. And by the way, in the case of the Jewish Welfare Board, these services were not limited to Jews. Okay? They extended it to every place. The Jews in Canada, in particular, certain difficulties. Their dead were buried under a cross because no Jewish Star of David was permitted. Nothing other than the Christian cross was permitted on a headstone. And so that became a major objective of Jewish Welfare Board activities. Locate Jews and get them buried according to Jewish rites. 230,000 Jews served in World War I, of which there were about 7,000 casualties. Some of you have heard of the Lost Battalion. The Lost Battalion was heavily Jewish. Okay? Data collection was extraordinarily important to the Jews. Why? Because they had never been able to show their contributions to American society in the previous 150 years of the existence of the Republic. There was a book provided by Rabbi Levinger, really instructive about the work of chaplains. And you realize that the religiously based organizations recruited, trained, and got into the field chaplains. Next one, the Salvation Army. Salvation Army has its beginnings in the 1850s. As many of you may know, they did mainly ringing doors and singing, etc. But if you don't realize it, their primary motivational force is, we are the spear and the tip of the spear in saving the soul of human beings. The Salvation Army is organized along military lines, and their goal was to have their service workers as close as possible to the front to save souls. They were the most popular of all the social welfare organizations, not because of their donuts. You've all heard about their donuts, right? You know, not because of their donuts. They were just simply the first ones to realize, you know, American soldiers like donuts. They don't like French crullers. They don't like French food. And it expanded from there. Religious services, okay? Ambulance services was real important for them. Having men and women at the front lines was extraordinarily important to them. Knights of Columbus and the National Catholic Welfare Workers Council. I've already told you about them. I won't go into them. They became the next most popular of social welfare organizations. Why? They in particular tried to extend services to everybody and not let the religious issues come into play with respect to Protestants and non-Catholics. Secondly, they also insisted on getting their cases out to the front lines. Okay? Third, for those that you were not familiar with this, most social welfare agencies charged you for me providing things to you. Whether it was letterhead, whether it was candy, whether it was pens, whether it was magazines. Guess what the Catholics didn't do? Guess what they didn't do? They didn't charge you for anything. As far as the Catholics were concerned, it was free. Because after all, you didn't have 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 cents to pay me something out at the front line. You got a little bit more important things to do than dig out money to pay me for a pencil. So the Catholics figure this is a practical way of providing services. Don't charge them. You wouldn't believe the ruckus it raised with the other social welfare organizations because they were being put in an embarrassing situation. They were transporting thousands and thousands of tons of material over to Europe. They were having to charge their members to pay for that stuff to being transported because, by the way, for those of you that don't know about the social welfare organization, they didn't receive a dime from the federal government. They had to pay it from their members' donations. They had to pay it from their members' contributions. And for those of you that are unfamiliar with this, it reached into the billions of dollars in today's money, and we'll talk about it in a few minutes. Another was, we talked about the YMCA all over the place. Okay, you have cards, you got welcoming committees, you got leave areas, you got things talking about camps. The YWCA stepped forward because of an important aspect that they recognize, and one of the few that recognize. The men like to have their women around. Whether those women be family, brothers, sisters, wives, girlfriends. The YWCA recognized that.
They stepped forward about 1912, 1913.
We're going to establish centers for soldiers and their wives and women to get together. We're going to establish daycare centers. Okay, this is kind of a big deal with women, isn't it? Not with men. For the children. So they can visit and the kids can be taken care of. The last one here is one that you rarely hear of, the War Camp Community Service. War Camp Community Service sprang out of the Playground Association. The War Camp Community Service agreed to provide services off base, taking you out to dinners, finding you homes to stay at, taking you to theater engagements, providing you with free meals at different locations throughout the cities. Why was this? Because what happens when you let go of 10,000 men from a camp on leave and they got nothing else to do in the town of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania? They realized there was a need. You had something like 180 camps built up in the United States in no time at all. And sure, maybe New York City could handle the release of 10,000 soldiers at one time, but many of them don't really want to deal with 10,000 drunks, you know, getting back on ship 2 days later at the Brooklyn Navy Yard and the surrounding Brooklyn neighborhoods, okay? So the War Camp Community Service stepped forward to do that. There were countless sources for providing monies to these organizations. In terms of the total amount that's been able to be identified so far of the private organization funding, okay, it came out to $215 million. In 2014 dollars, that's $3.5 billion. The YMCA accounted for 60%, the YWCA 10%, the National Catholic Organizations 18%, and the others this. This does not take into account the United War Work campaign conducted in October and November of 1918. In that campaign, which all the organizations agreed to under the behest of President Wilson. President Wilson was saying, you know, we're raising so much money in different places. Let's consolidate into one. The United War Work campaign was a result of it. In that instance, Woodrow Wilson said, and the Catholics will be included, because the other 6 organizations didn't want the Catholics involved. Okay, so he comes back in early September and said the Catholics will be included. In that campaign, $240 million was raised. That is roughly another $3.5 billion. So during the war, you add those two together, you'll see that roughly $7 billion was raised for these organizations.
Thank you for watching this presentation on the subject of social welfare for the American military in World War I. I would like to thank the Broomfield Veterans Memorial Museum for inviting me to share this material with its members. There is much more to this story that time did not allow. If you would like more information about this subject in the way of monographs, contact Sergio Lugo. For more information regarding stamp collecting and postal history, I invite you to visit the Rocky Mountain Philatelic Library in Denver, Colorado, or to visit its website.